Hi, I'm Kylie, just another Army vet, and today I'm reacting to a pretty controversial video from the Tucker Carlson network. This was from a conversation that he had with a man named Darryl Cooper. This is why Winston Churchill shouldn't be seen as a hero. I've not seen this video yet. However, I did do a little bit of research on it, and initially I thought that this video was going to be about India, because most Indians actually believe that Churchill was as bad a villain as Stalin and Hitler. So I was very surprised to learn that this video has nothing to do with India. Let's get to it.
I'm American. I'm not English, so I don't have any weird motive in asking this, but how would you assess Winston Churchill?
I got in trouble with my podcast partner, Jocko Willink, one time because he's a New England Dutchman whose his family, it's near and dear to they're Dutch, but very near and dear to their heart that Winston Churchill is a hero, right?
Well, everyone
thinks that. He really thinks that. And
Not India. They don't love him.
I told him that I think, and maybe I'm being a little hyperbolic, maybe, but I told him, maybe trying to provoke him a little bit, that I thought Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. Now, he didn't kill the most people. He didn't commit the most atrocities. But I believe, and I think when you really get into it and tell the story right and don't leave anything out, you see that he was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did, becoming something other than an invasion of Poland.
So Winston Churchill was responsible for the war, meaning that Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini and Emperor Hirohito, that they did nothing. That is a very odd comment that makes no sense, and Churchill was not even in power when Poland was invaded.
At every step of the way, like, people are very often, I find, surprised to learn. There's a two-step process.
Well,
right?
why don't you just make the case for that? Okay, so you've made your statement. A lot of people are thinking, well, wait a second. You just said Churchill, my childhood hero, the guy with the cigar.
Yeah. Well, and the next thought that comes into their head is that, oh, you're saying Churchill was the chief villain, therefore his enemies, Adolf Hitler and so forth, were
Stalin,
the protagonists, right?
Yeah.
That they're the good guys if you think he's a villain. That's not the case. That's not what I'm saying. Germany, look, they put themselves into a position, and Adolf Hitler is chiefly responsible for this, but his whole regime is responsible for it, that when they went into the East in 1941, they launched a war where they were completely unprepared to deal with the millions and millions of prisoners of war, of local political prisoners and so forth, that they were going to have to handle. They went in with no plan for that.
So that's a load of crap, because one, they had the final solution, and two, they had other policies such as hunger politico or something. I'm not sure the name of it, but it was a starvation policy. As the Germans were taking over Soviet territories, they actually planned on taking all their food and diverting it to German troops. They even anticipated mass famines. So yes, they did have some plans in place.
And they just threw these people into camps, and millions of people ended up dead there. You have like letters as early as July, August 1941 from commandants of these makeshift camps that they're setting up for these millions of people who are surrendering or people they're rounding up. And so it's 2 months after, a month or two after Barbarossa was launched. And they're writing back to the high command in Berlin saying, we can't feed these people. We don't have the food to feed these people. And one of them actually says, rather than wait for them all to slowly starve this winter, wouldn't it be more humane to just finish them off quickly now? And so this is like 2 months into the invasion, right? And like my view on this, I argue with my Zionist interlocutors about this all the time with regard to the current war in Gaza.
I don't understand his logic. They weren't trying to be humane to anyone. Out of close to 6 million Soviet POWs in German camps, I believe over 3 million of them died of exposure, starvation, death marches, executions, etc. There was no humanity, because they had planned for the starvation of all these people, and they had planned for slave labor, and they had planned for all the death camps.
Look, man, like maybe you, as the Germans, you felt like you had to invade to the east. Maybe you thought that Stalin was such a threat, or that if he launched a surprise attack and seized the oil fields in Romania, that you would now not have the fuel to actually respond, and you'd be crippled, and all of Europe would be under threat, and whatever it was that, like, maybe you thought you had to do that. But at the end of the day, you launched that war with no plan to care for the millions and millions of civilians and prisoners of war that were going to come under your control. And
that's right. There was no plan to care for them. There was a plan to use them as slave labor, to starve them out, and to kill them. And Hitler, he wrote in, I think, Mein Kampf, about some concept. I can't think of the word, but it was the idea that Germany needed breathing room to the east. I think I read somewhere, and I cannot verify this because I don't know, but I read somewhere that even in the late 1930s, Hitler was actually talking with his generals about eventually invading the USSR. If someone wants to fact check me on that, then please drop it in the comments.
Millions of people died because of that, right? And you can look at it and say, like, So get back to your main question about Churchill. If you go to 1939, when the Germans and the Soviet Union invade Poland, as soon as that war's wrapped up on the German side, Hitler starts firing off peace proposals to Britain and France because they had already declared war. He didn't expect them to declare war, actually. Like, there's a famous scene where he kind of throws a fit when he finds out that they did do that. And so he doesn't want to fight France. He doesn't want to fight Britain. He feels that's going to weaken Europe when we've got this huge threat to the east, the communist threat over there.
But I could have sworn that Great Britain and France actually signed some sort of treaty or agreement with Poland saying that if Poland was ever invaded, that they would actually come to their aid. And for some reason, Hitler was surprised that France and Germany were actually honoring their commitment. That was a dumb miscalculation by Hitler.
And he starts firing off peace proposals. He says, let's not do this. Like, we can't do this. And of course, a year goes by, 1940 comes around, and they're still at war. And so he launches his invasion to the west, takes over France, takes over Western and Northern Europe. Once that's done, and the British have, escaped at Dunkirk. There's no British force left on the continent. There's no opposing force left on the continent. In other words, the war is over, and the Germans won. Okay.
What?
By what point?
Fall of 1940, right? So there's literally no opposing force on the continent.
So I'm pausing the video for a moment because as I'm editing it, I realized that I missed a huge lie that he actually said. He said in the fall of 1940, the war was pretty much over. There was no opposing force left on the continent. Well, I would love to see him say those exact words to some Greeks. October 1940 until April of 1941, it was the Greco-Italian War, in which the Greeks were actually fighting Italy and Germany.
And throughout that summer, Adolf Hitler is firing off radio broadcasts, giving speeches, literally sending planes over to drop leaflets over London and other British cities, trying to get the message to these people that Germany does not want to fight you. Like, we don't want to fight you. Offering peace proposals that, it said, you keep all your overseas colonies. We don't want any of that. We want Britain to be strong. The world needs Britain to be strong, especially as we face this communist threat and so forth. Like, this is what's going on.
What was the timeline? He said summer of 1940, because I think it was late 1940 to summer of 1941 was when the Blitz happened. It was 8 or 9 months of indiscriminate bombing by the Germans on England. I think 45,000 civilians were killed. Close to 100,000 were actually injured. Parents sent their kids away from the big cities to go live in the countryside or in the United States or in other safe countries.
And I think that if there were people in Britain who well, if they hadn't put it this way, if they hadn't been so successful at delegitimizing the peace approach by demonizing Neville Chamberlain and so forth, and holding him responsible for the invasion of Poland, that people would have been, they would have understood, like, we don't need a repeat of the First World War. We don't, which is not what ended up happening, but that's what everybody thought was going to happen.
Churchill thought that World War II was going to happen. In the 1930s, he was a big advocate for peace, while at the same time, he advocated for the West actually arming itself. He knew that disarmament did not mean peace. Only when Hitler forced his hand did he decide that war was the best option. He himself even called it the unnecessary war.
And so Churchill, I mean, you have a guy, Churchill wanted a war. He wanted to fight Germany. And the reason that I don't begrudge him that, people can national leaders, you can fight whoever you want. If you feel like your the long-term interests of the British Empire are threatened by the rise of a powerful continental power like Germany, and you need to check that those are great power games, and you play them the way you feel like you need to play them. That's fine.
Great Britain is 500-600 miles away from Germany. They don't even share a border. Oh my goodness.
The reason I resent Churchill so much for it is that he kept this war going when he had no way to go back and fight this war. All he had were bombers. He was literally, by 1940, sending bomber fleets to go firebomb the Black Forest, just to burn down sections of the Black Forest. Just rank terrorism, going through and starting to, what eventually became just the carpet bombing, the saturation bombing of civilian neighborhoods, to kill, is the purpose of which was to kill as many civilians as possible.
Their goal was to target infrastructure, industry, and military targets, including supply lines, which is why they did bomb certain sections of the Black Forest.
And all the men were out in the field. All the fighting age men were out in the field. And so this is old people, it's women and children, and they knew that. And they were wiping these places out. It was as gigantic scaled terrorist attacks, the greatest, scale of terrorist attacks you've ever seen in world history.
Why would he do that?
Because it was the only means that they had to continue fighting at the time. They didn't have the ability to reinvade Europe. And so he needed to keep this war going until he accomplished what he hoped to accomplish. We know now there's actually a really great series of books. It's one of the best. I recommend it to everybody, but it's really expensive now. And it's 6 long volumes called History of British Special Operations in the Second World War. And one of the books gets into the level of just the extent of media operations, propaganda operations, everything that they were running in the United States to eventually drag us into that war. And that was his whole plan. His whole plan was, we don't have a way to fight this war ourselves. This war is over. We need either the Soviet Union or the United States to do it for us. And that was the plan, and kept the war going long enough for that plan to come to fruition. And to me, it's a craven, ugly way to fight a war.
So you're trying to honor your commitment to Poland and to protect your homeland. And you have a great navy, you have bombers, but you're out of options on what you can do to actually win the war. So you go to the United States and start doing this propaganda, trying to get FDR to actually say, yes, we will actually join the war. But the U.S. was hands off, and they wanted nothing to do with the war. It wasn't until when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and I think the next day, Germany declared war on the U.S., did the United States actually say, okay, we're going to war. To me, that sounds like a logical way to fight a war. I don't know what his problem is.
And
what was the motive?
Well, Churchill's got a long and complicated history. I mean, he's somebody who
that was the wryest smile I think I've ever seen.
Yeah. Well, look, I think on one level, there was a sense that Churchill was sort of humiliated by his performance in the First World War as the head of the Admiralty, and he was out in the cold for a long time.
I mean, Gallipoli.
Yeah. And which, you know, that was his operation.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and so he was rightly held responsible for that and seen as responsible for one of the great disasters that the British suffered during that war. And so I think part of it was probably kind of personal. You know, he wanted redemption. He wanted to go out there and like prove that he's the warlord that they can go out there and fight this big war. Probably. I think part of it, I read about Churchill, and he strikes me as a psychopath. But he's also a sort of, I mean, he was a drunk. He was very childish in strange ways. People would talk about how, as an adult, like as prime minister, they'd find him in his room and he's like playing with action figures like war toys and army men and stuff, and would get mad when people would interrupt him.
Your helmet is so big. Lord helmet, what?
You know, when he was doing that. So this is a strange fellow, you know. There's all those things. But then you get into, why was Winston Churchill such a dedicated booster of Zionism from early on in his life, right? And there's ideological reasons. Like in 1920, he wrote a kind of infamous now article called Zionism versus Bolshevism. And he basically makes the case that, which was true to a large extent, that all of Eastern Europe, the Pale of Settlement, which is where the vast majority of Jews lived, other than the United States, which is where a lot of them had traveled to, that area had become so engulfed by a revolutionary spirit that all the young Ashkenazi Jews who were over there were getting swept up into it. It was the 60s here on steroids, right? And in a much more serious and ended up being destructive way. And this is 1920, so this is shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution. Basically, the point of his paper is he says these people who are over there, they're all going one direction or the other. They're going to be Bolsheviks. They're going to be Zionists. We want them to be Zionists, you know, and
Yes.
so we need to support this. And so that was early on. There was an ideological component of it. But then as time goes on, you know, you read stories about Churchill going bankrupt and needing money, getting bailed out by people who shared his interests.
I don't think Churchill ever officially went bankrupt. I think he did have to go to people for money many times, but he wasn't officially bankrupt. If you do know for sure, then please drop that in the comments.
You know, in terms of Zionism, but also his hostility, I think his hostility to, put it this way, I think his hostility to Germany was real. I don't think that he necessarily had to be bribed to have that feeling. But, you know, I think he was, to an extent, put in place by people, the financiers, by a media complex that wanted to make sure that he was the guy who, who was representing Britain in that conflict for a reason.
If Joseph Goebbels had not killed himself and his wife and his 6 children with cyanide, and I would have guessed that this is some long-lost relative, maybe a great-grandson. But he seems to have taken a lot of lessons from him. Thank you for watching this video, but unfortunately, I think we all lost some brain cells listening to that man speak. He literally tried to make Hitler and the Nazis look good in this interview. Let's go ahead and just recap the interview. Hitler wanted peace, not war. Churchill was a bankrupt drunk who liked to play with his toys, wanted redemption for Gallipoli, supported Zionists, and was a warmonger who should have dishonored his allegiance to Poland and other countries and should have allowed Hitler to take over all of Europe and the Axis powers to take over the world. This interview was full of lies and exaggerations. It was like he just grabbed some random sentences from Wikipedia out of context about Churchill and World War II and threw them randomly into this interview. I'm not even a historian, yet I could debunk half of what he said. I'm not saying that Cooper is or isn't an H denier, but at the very least, he is a Nazi sympathizer and apologist. If you notice, he did not use the term final solution or any of its associated terms one time in this interview. Considering that Carlson gave this lunatic a platform, I think it's important that this video gets shared as much as possible. because I want this so-called historian to actually be exposed for who he actually is. With that being said, please go ahead and actually like this video and share it. That will help this video reach more people. Or you can dislike the video. It doesn't matter. And I really want you guys to comment down below because I want to hear what you guys have to say. And if you do want to learn about history from an actual historian, then please go ahead and check out Indian Idol.